The Old Testament 6. The Little Lame Prince. Is there any little girl or boy here who would like to sit still in a chair all day long and never go roller skating or slide downhill on a brand new sled? Just have nothing to do but sit around? I do not believe you would like even to be a prince if all you could do was look at your beautiful toys and only sit. But once there was a little boy, a prince, who was not able to play with children. If he went anywhere, he had to be carried. The little fellow was lame. Both his feet were crippled. The poor little prince had no mother to love him and take care of him. It would have been so much better for him if his mother had lived. We all of us know how good it is to have a mother, especially if we are unhappy and want a great deal of petting. The little lame prince's name was Mephibosheth, a long name for small mouths to speak. But if you just take one syllable at a time and say it slowly, you will get it. Don't give up if you miss it the first time. When the prince was a little boy only 5 years old, there was a terrible war. His father and his grandfather were in the war. His grandfather, King Saul, and his father, Jonathan, had to leave their home and fight in a dreadful battle. So one morning they must have said goodbye to the little prince and told him what all grandfathers and fathers tell their little boys: "Be a good boy until we come back." But they never came back. His father and his grandfather, King Saul, were killed in the terrible battle. The little prince had a good nurse who was kind to him and took care of him. She was in the king's palace alone with the little boy when she heard that all his uncles and cousins, his father and his grandfather, had been killed in the war. Now there was no one left to love him but his nurse. She was afraid to stay any longer in the king's house. The Philistines who had killed Saul and Jonathan were on their way to the palace. Of course, they would take the little prince captive and perhaps kill him and burn down the palace. But the nurse was not going to let the Philistines get the little fellow. She decided to run away to some of her friends and take him with her. She picked him up and threw him across her shoulder and ran out of the palace and down the hill. She had a long way to go, up and down steep hills and across a river. It may have been night when she ran away, and so dark that she could not see where she was going. She ought to have gone slowly in the dark, but she was in such a hurry that she ran. A boy 5 years old is heavy, so I do not think she carried the little prince all the way. She must have put him down and told him he would have to do some running for himself. How those little feet did fly! He and his nurse were in such a hurry that the little fellow had a bad fall and hurt both his feet. The night of that terrible journey was the last time those little feet ever ran or walked. Mephibosheth was a cripple all the rest of his life. When the little lame prince grew to be a man, he found a kind friend. This friend had loved his father Jonathan. Who do you think this good friend was? It was King David, the one you remember who killed the giant Goliath. Ever since Mephibosheth and his nurse had run away from his grandfather, Saul's palace, King David had been fighting the troublesome Philistines. At last David drove them out of the country. Everybody was happy and comfortable once more. King David, you remember, loved Jonathan, the father of the little lame prince. David had promised that he would always take care of Jonathan's children. But only one little child was left, and that was Mephibosheth. When King David found him, he was no longer a little prince. He was a man, a big prince. Even though Mephibosheth was no longer a little boy, he needed a kind friend like King David. For he was a cripple. In those days, people were not kind to cripples. Most of the time, they were treated very cruelly. Sometimes cripples were made to stay outdoors no matter how cold it was. Often they did not have enough to eat, and they had to beg for the little they had. David sent for Mephibosheth to come and live with him. He was always to live in the king's palace. He was to be treated as a prince, always wear warm and beautiful clothes, and always have enough to eat every single day. Just think of it. Sit with the king at his table and be waited on as though he were King David's son. No one ever would treat Mephibosheth cruelly again because David was his friend. The ewe lamb. Once upon a time there was a very rich man. He lived in a large house on top of a high hill. His house was beautiful. Rich rugs covered the floor. The lamps were all of gold and silver. In some of the rooms there were cool, splashing fountains, but not a chair nor a table anywhere. In those days, when people grew tired, they sat on the floor with their feet curled under them. When they ate, they sat on the floor in the same way, but it wasn't hard for them, as they had soft rugs under them and piles of comfortable cushions at their backs. After you had gone all over this rich man's house, you went to see what he owned outside of it. There was a beautiful garden with a wealth of flowers in it, pink and red and blue and yellow, every kind of happy color, pretty posy. Birds sang in it, and no doubt fishes darted back and forth in the marble fountains. On the green hillsides were herds of fat cattle and flocks of woolly sheep nibbling their dinner from the grassy ground. Camels with bells about their necks. The man had in plenty. Sleek oxen there were to plow his fields, and donkeys upon which he rode. Besides all these, he had great orchards of olive trees and figs, and heavy clusters of grapes peeped out from among the vines in the vineyard. Close by this man there lived another one who was very poor. He and his children lived in a small house with only one room in it, a mud hut, probably, or perhaps a large cave in one of the huge rocks on the hillside. The only beds these poor people had were rough, shaggy goat skins. The father had no money to buy clothes for his children, and they had no mother to make them clothes. But in that hot country, poor little children went around and played in the burning sun. So these little folks were happy. Sometimes when the rich man walked upon the roof in the evening, he could hear the shouts of the children at play. They sang and danced outside their miserable hut, and drank their supper of goat's milk from coarse wooden bowls. The little folks had a playfellow, a little lamb that kicked up its heels and shook its woolly tail as it capered about with the children. Sometimes it put its small nose in the children's bowls and drank greedily of the milk. The little lamb slept with them at night. It was such a pretty lamb, its fleece must have been always snowy white, for the children loved their pet and wanted its soft wool to look pure and clean. No cattle, no goats, no camels did the poor man have. Nothing but this little lamb, with which his children played, belonged to him. He had 2 hands with which he worked to earn money to buy his little one's food. One evening the rich man saw the frisky little lamb playing with his neighbor's children. "Just the thing," said the rich man. "I have a guest tonight, and I must give him a feast. That lamb will make a fine roast for my guest." Why didn't he take a sheep from his own flocks? Great juicy grapes, luscious figs, and rich olives he could have spread before his guest. But he wanted this neighbor's pet lamb, and only thing his neighbor and his children had to make them happy. What a cruel thing to do! Imagine the little children going crying to bed while the rich man and his guests were eating their pet lamb for supper. Nathan the prophet came and told David all about it. David was very angry. "How can anyone be so selfish and wicked?" he said. "A person without pity for the poor man deserves to die," he told Nathan. Make that rich man give his poor neighbor many lambs, in place of the one he stole away," commanded David. The king looked fine and grand as he spoke. Everyone who heard him must have said, "Isn't that just like our noble David?" Nathan did not smile. He looked sad and stern, as pointing his finger at David, he said, "You are the man. It is you who have done this wicked deed. Poor, poor David. Can't you see him? Hang his head, ashamed to look in Nathan's face." Yes, he remembered he had taken from a poor man his only treasure. It was not a lamb he had stolen, but it was something the poor man valued, and it was all the poor man had. Now David knew why Nathan had told him this dreadful tale of cruel greed. He, the king, had done wrong. As the King David had a right to take away anything that he wanted from any one of his people. It was not the king's law, but God's law that he had disobeyed. And it was God's law that David really wished to keep, for he loved the God who had made him king. Will God forgive my doing the very thing I am punishing other people for doing? He must have said. What do you suppose the king did when he was alone? Fell on his face in his bedchamber, clothed himself in sackcloth, and put ashes on his head. I know he must have done so, for David was sorry and ashamed. And in David's country, that is what people did when they felt sorry. God has blessed you with peace, but since you have done this thing, the sword shall never depart from thy house, Nathan told David, and it was so. Joab, the general of his army, disobeyed him. His sons quarreled, and savage neighbors kept always troubling him. He could not give back what he had taken from the poor man, for the man was dead. God had made him king, and he had not been as good a king as he himself wanted to be. It was God he had forgotten when he did this wicked thing, and that is why David said, "Against thee, thee only have I sinned, and done that which is evil in thy sight." Absalom's hair. How many little boys like to wear beautiful long curls? Not many, I'm sure. But there was a time when big men let their hair grow long. Some wore it curled and oiled until it shone, or had it braided with gold thread. Absalom, King David's son, had beautiful black hair. It was long and heavy. He was proud of his hair and of his face, too, for he was praised for his beauty. The people called him the handsomest man in all Israel. He was a wicked son. He envied his father and his brothers and wanted his father to die so that he could be king. He kept telling the people how much more he would do for them if he were chosen king. And at last the foolish people believed him. Then Absalom and David's people banded together to turn the king out of his palace and make him leave Jerusalem. From the beautiful city, poor unhappy David had to run away and hide from Absalom and his soldiers. All the people who loved David followed him. Not one of his old soldiers or his generals deserted him. It was a long, long caravan of miserable and unhappy people that went out of the gates of Jerusalem and toiled up the slopes of Mount Olivet. They wept and wailed as they went. Was the great kingdom of Israel going to be destroyed by a wicked usurper? Stealing a kingdom from the rightful king, or trying to take his place, is usurping. Absalom was trying to take the place of his own father, King David, but Joab, the captain of David's army, did not weep. He did not even look sorry. The others might walk barefooted over the sharp stones, hold their heads down and cover them with their mantles because they were so grieved. Joab, the warrior, had no time to cry. Absalom was a traitor, and he intended not to cry over, but to punish him. Do you know that Ahithophel, the wise man, has deserted you and is advising Absalom? One of David's soldiers asked him. The king answered only by saying, O God, make the advice of Ahithophel seem foolish to Absalom. But Hushai, David's friend, was far wiser than Ahithophel. Everyone supposed Ahithophel was the wisest man in all Israel. No one ever thought of contradicting him. Hushai was a wiser man because he knew how to manage Absalom, and that was the one thing Ahithophel did not know. At the top of the hill, the sad caravan stopped. The people were hungry and tired. Ziba, a servant of the house of Saul, was waiting for them there. He had a fine lunch ready for them. 2 donkeys with great packs filled full of good things to eat must have made them glad. Perhaps you would like to know what those packs on the donkeys' backs held. Bread, loaves, and loaves of it, raisins, summer fruits, and a bottle of wine. Hushai was there too, but he did not stay. He was on his way to Jerusalem to defeat Ahithophel's counsel. No doubt he ran all the way. The first thing he did when he came to the palace was to greet Absalom with a shout and say, "Long live the king! Long live the king!" These words flattered Absalom wonderfully. Can't you see him swell with royal pride when he hears himself called king? Ahithophel had never said such fine things to him. He had only given him excellent advice. Hushai knew that the king's son liked flattery better than he liked advice, even though that advice was good. Of course, Absalom listened to what Hushai told him to do, which was the worst thing he could have done, for Hushai advised him to do the very thing that would destroy him. All through the night, soldiers kept coming to David's camp and offering to fight on his side. When morning came, King David had a large army ready for battle. During the night, he and his soldiers had slipped down into the valley and crossed the river. Another good friend was waiting there for the king and his soldiers. Shobi had brought beds for the men to sleep on and dishes from which they ate. That night their supper was almost a banquet. Shobi had brought barley, wheat, and parched grain, beans and lentils and honey and butter and cheese. He even gave them sheep, for hungry soldiers like meat. The next morning they would have seen Absalom riding on his mule, with his long hair floating in the breeze. He went into the woods where the battle was fought. Much surprised he must have been to find the woods full of King David's powerful soldiers. Absalom's army was beaten. Perhaps Absalom was frightened and lost his way, or his hair may have blown in his eyes and blinded him. He surely could not have seen where he was going, for he let the mule run under a tree. Its branches were so low that they caught his hair and pulled him from his mule. The animal trotted on and left him hanging there. How Absalom must have struggled and thrown his arms about him, trying to get free. But his beautiful hair was long and strong, and he could not tear it from the branches. Joab saw him struggling, but he did not pity him. Absalom was a traitor, and he must die, the warrior thought. He killed the prince as he hung by his hair. David had commanded his generals not to harm Absalom. Joab did not obey. He was only a warrior, not Absalom's own father. That made a difference. Back into Jerusalem went the king, his people, and his soldiers. The kingdom was again David's, but David had lost his son. Up in the chamber over the gate of the city he mourned, saying, "O my son Absalom, would I had died for thee, O Absalom, my son, my son." A story of Solomon. Solomon's wisdom. It was a very, very little baby, and it was to be cut in two. Dreadful, wasn't it? There are a great many things that can be divided, and it doesn't hurt them a bit. But a baby? Who ever heard of a baby that was good for anything after it was cut in half like an apple? But the baby in this story must be divided. Solomon, the wise king of Israel, had said that it should be done. In the days when this baby lived, no one ever thought of disobeying the king unless he was the king's general. Then sometimes he disobeyed. But ordinary people had to obey or lose their heads. No one wished to lose his head, even though it may be a poor one with nothing in it. You may think Solomon was a wicked man, or else that he disliked babies. Possibly you wonder if the baby cried so much that Solomon ordered it cut in two in order to stop its noise. You will never guess the reason if you sit up all night to think about it. I shall have to tell it to you. King Solomon was wise. People thought he knew everything, and he did come very near it. He knew so much that people came to him from all over the country to ask his advice. Whenever there was a quarrel, he was expected to settle it. It was early in the morning. Dewdrops were still hanging on the grass blades when a long line of people climbed the hill to the king's palace. In that country, people did their traveling either very early or very late in the day. The burning sun made everyone want to lie still and sleep in the middle of the day. The people were toiling slowly up the steep slopes because this was the day King Solomon was going to sit on his great golden throne in his judgment hall while they told him all their troubles. Some of the people were quiet. Others were so noisy you could not hear the screaming of the peacocks in the king's garden. Some were crying, others were fighting as they walked. A few of them came slinking along as though they were ashamed, while a number ran so fast, I'm sure by the time they reached Solomon's palace, they would not have breath enough left to tell their wrongs. The doors of the judgment hall swung open as the people crowded into the hall where Solomon sat. Then a young baby began to cry. I do not wonder, for it must have been uncomfortable. 2 women were quarreling over it. I wonder they did not drop it as they fought and struggled. First one would snatch it and then the other. The women rudely pushed themselves inside the hall and came before the king. How grand he looked, seated in his wonderful chair of ivory and gold. He had arms for him to lean upon, a rich, heavy canopy hung over it. People had to go up 6 steps to reach the king, and as they went they walked between 6 pairs of glistening golden lions. Up the steps, the throne, the women ran. Both were very angry, and one of them had been crying. What is the matter? Solomon asked. The woman with the crying baby came close to the king. This baby in my arms is my little son, she answered. That other woman's baby is dead, and she is trying to steal mine. My son is not dead, he's alive, screamed the second woman. She stole my baby when I was asleep and put her dead child in my arms. The live baby is mine, and the dead one is hers, both shrieked. Both claimed the poor baby, who was alive. Each woman said she was its mother, and both of them nearly tore the little creature in two as they snatched him back and forth from each other's arms. You shall each have him, said Solomon. I will have him divided, and you shall each have half. Then he called for his sword. How its sharp edge glistened as the sunbeam shot along its blade. The poor woman who had been crying so bitterly flung herself down before the king with outstretched arms. Don't hurt him! Oh, don't hurt him! Let the other woman have him, she cried. Divide him, said the other woman. We will neither one of us have him. Put up the sword, said King Solomon to his soldier. Give the baby to the woman who would not have him killed. She is his mother. Do you think the king was right? Everyone in the judgment hall seemed to think so. The 2 women went down the steps and out into the king's beautiful garden. 2 little doves upon the roof of the palace were cooing peacefully. The mother unwrapped the little bundle and held the sleeping baby close to her face. She too gave a soft coo. The baby was not crying now, for it was safe in its own mother's arms.